Okay, we're at 2 o'clock, so maybe we can go ahead and get ourselves started here. Hello, everybody out there. Welcome. Thank you for joining us on this Friday afternoon. If I haven't had the chance to meet you before, my name is Jeff Bennett. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm an associate professor of communication studies at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. I wanted to start by thanking the panelists who are joining us today. They have 4 fabulous papers and I'm very excited to share them with you. So thank you to them for doing this great work. I also wanted to thank the folks at RSA who put this together, especially Krista Kennedy, Jen Milkowski, Eric Detweiler, who I've been in a lot of contact with. And I also wanted to thank our friends in the Department of Communication and Rhetorical Studies at Syracuse University for sponsoring this event. To give you just a little bit of background, this session is stemming from a forum that focuses on queer lives in theory and studies in the COVID-19 era that will be published later this year in QED, a journal of GLBTQ world making. And all of the invited authors were given license to explore whatever aspect of the pandemic they liked, and we ended up with a really fabulous collection of essays. They make contributions not only to queer studies and rhetoric, but also health and medicine, pleasure and intimacy, media and technology, among many others. And before moving forward, I also wanted to just give a quick shout out to the other contributors to the forum. They include Marlon Bailey, Huling Ding, Leah Hernandez, Ted Kerr, Marina Lavina, Elizabeth Lapari, J. Blake Scott, Sarah De Los Santos Upton, Gus Yep, and the folks at Sage Metro Detroit who do wonderful work with aging LGBTQ plus communities. I also wanted to say thank you to Chuck Morris and Tom Nakayama, who are the editors of QED, for giving us the space to do that. A quick couple of heads up really quickly as we proceed. First of all, if you have questions during the panel, feel free to use the Q&A feature that you find here. The Q&A feature is a lot like the traditional chat feature, except the panelists and I can track them in real time. I'm going to do my best to see what themes are emerging and have our panelists engage those things afterward, but the panelists can see them in real time as well, though they might want to look after they get done presenting. It might be easier for them that way. The other thing that I wanted to point out was that for disability purposes, if you need a transcript, you can click on the button up at the top left where it says custom live streaming services, and it will produce a written transcript for you as well. With that, I wanted to turn it over to our presenters. And so I will go ahead and introduce them one at a time right before they speak, and we'll just go in standard alphabetical order. So our first presenter, who I'm thrilled to have with us, Amar Jean Christian, or AJ, is an associate professor of communication studies at Northwestern University. His first book, Open TV, Innovation Beyond Hollywood and the Rise of Web Television, was published by NYU Press, and in it he argues that the web brought innovation to television by opening development to independent producers. His work has been published in numerous academic journals, and those include the International Journal of Communication, Television and New Media, the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies, and Continuum. His paper today is titled The Pandemic Clears Media Pollution and Queers the Ecosystem. AJ, please.
Thank you, Jeff. And just for a reminder, how much time should I be speaking right now?
7 to 8 minutes, and I can give you a heads up when you've got like a minute or 2 left.
That would be great. Just like wave your hands if you can. So thank you all for joining us on this Zoom. We're all on so many Zooms, so I really do honor everybody's Zoom time these days. I was really fortunate. I'm really happy when Jeff invited me to reflect on the pandemic because the shutdown that happened in March really shifted my media consumption practices in ways that were very much in development while I was writing the piece. So I wrote the piece in present tense, which is not always my way of writing, but I wanted the piece to feel like it was in the moment. So I called it The Pandemic Clears Media Pollution and Queers the Ecosystem to meditate on some thinking I've been doing around kind of going back to the ecological approach to media that was more prominent a few decades ago, as we have now so much media around us in so many different formats. What does it mean to live a life through media now in the pandemic? And how do we get a sense of the scope of our full lives through media and as a society as well, not just as individuals? So the idea of media pollution is really, for me, thinking about television studies over the course of the past 20 years, the amount of television, both narrative and unscripted, though I focus on narrative, has increased exponentially. And now pretty much around 600 narrative TV shows are released every year in the United States alone. That doesn't include foreign TV shows that are imported, and it doesn't include web series and independent production and TikTok and Instagram and all the other things that we might think of as serialized narratives. So I've been watching a lot of TV as a TV scholar, and in the pandemic, I found myself increasingly rejecting corporate TV and moving to other forms of mediated communication that were more lo-fi, more grassroots, rougher, because one, corporate TV production kind of stopped with the pandemic, like everything else. And two, in the midst of such obvious strife and drama in the real world, most television shows just felt very thin and basic to me and unsatisfying. And that became especially true in late May, early June, when we had the coinciding Black Lives Matter uprisings. That for me, that was when I started to write this piece, and I was writing it in that moment. And I really just couldn't watch almost anything on Netflix or HBO or anything like that. I think Tiger King was kind of the hot show at that moment, and it was absolutely not going to be in my repertoire. I just couldn't bring myself to care about this, white, queer, polyamorous criminal, I don't know, in the midst of, Black people dying at the hands of police and people rioting on the streets. So instead, I was watching, the drag shows that have really stormed Twitch over the last few months, and seeing drag queens try to make do and create art with what they had. And in such large numbers, 2-3 hour shows every single week, drag queens around the world sort of creating these things really caught my imagination and really kind of took me to another place. I found myself watching archival public access on YouTube. There's some Black Public Affairs TV that's on YouTube that's been on my queue forever that I just never really watched before, to be honest, not at length. And I was really kind of moved by the simplicity of it, just like, here's a 1 to 2 hour conversation with leaders in the community, and they were really getting into the messiness of it. That in the context of like MSNBC or CNN felt so much richer and more fulfilling in a moment where I felt like I didn't need the news of the day. The news of the day was the same thing every day. People were dying and people were protesting. Instead, I wanted a rich examination of culture and politics and a sense of history, right? A sense of where we are at now versus where we've been before. I've also been watching video games, just kind of trying to consume longer narratives because I had so much more time because I wasn't going out. So, on the weekends, I would sit down and watch a video game for like 4 or 5 hours and finish a 15-20 hour video game in 1 or 2 weekends. I teach video games every year. I do like a week on it, but I never have time to play video games. So it's always my worst week of the year class. And last year or the year before, because I was on sabbatical, which is also why I had time to watch all this stuff. Disclaimer, my students laughed at me because I hadn't heard of Fortnite. And this was 2 years ago, but still, it was huge back then. And so that was my wake-up call that I had been ignoring the video game art form. And there's really a tremendous amount of video games, both at the higher budget level that, they're more white, but there's a lot of more feminist narratives now. And in the indie level, there's an incredible range of expression, and the games are shorter too. So a lot of them you can watch in 2 or 3 hours like it was a movie. And indeed, film studios like Annapurna have interactive divisions where they create video games. So that was really enriching for me because I think when narratives are drawn out like that, there's a different temporality to the media viewing experience that I think I wasn't really accessing through television and film. And I watched more independent films too, because I wasn't watching as much television. I was watching more foreign films. And Bacurau, I think I mentioned in the piece, is this Brazilian film about this kind of queer indigenous community in the hinterland that finds themselves the target of a very strange global fascist invasion, and they fight them back. And it was amazing, and something that maybe in the pandemic, when I was going out and being social and watching television, I might not have found the time for. So in general, I found my media viewing experience to be broader, more durational, more experimental, more lo-fi. And for me, that gave me a vision of how media could be without corporations pushing so much out, right? That we might actually get a more queer, organic, localized view of media consumption and video, especially when you consider Instagram and TikTok and people taking their phones out in protests and really actually becoming media producers in a very hyper-local way, right? Like all of a sudden, Instagram wasn't populated by people going to Tulum and Puerto Vallarta, but like the protest, that was the thing to do in the summer. And so we were kind of connected to our communities through media in a way that I think we haven't been in a while. And this, for me, clears the pollution of corporate media and exposes a more organic, localized ecosystem that I think is naturally better suited to a queer way of living and being.
Great, thank you so much. And again, just a reminder to our audience, if you have questions that arise as we're going, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A, and we will be sure to give them some attention. Our second speaker today is Michaela Frechette, an assistant professor of communication studies at Towson University. Michaela specializes in rhetorical criticism with an emphasis on feminist and queer ways of knowing. Her research focuses on meaning-making practices forged by women communicating pleasure and sex in a variety of public spheres. Michaela's research is published in outlets that include Women's Studies in Communication, Argumentation and Advocacy, and Women in Language and Sexualities. Her paper today is titled Finding Pleasure in the Pandemic, or Confronting COVID-19 Anxiety Through Queer Feminist Pleasure Politics. Michaela.
Okay. There we go. Thanks so much for the introduction, Jeff. I am really excited to be part of this conversation today, and I'm especially thrilled that the pages of the forum are coming to life here in this unique virtual format. The conditions of a global pandemic are indeed, like this forum and this present conversation explores, painful and horrifying. Pandemic conditions are, in a word, capital F, fucked. And so when I was invited to contribute something about finding pleasure in the pandemic, I just didn't want to. The pandemic is making things fucked, not fucking allowing us to fuck. And so what could I say about pleasure in the pandemic? When the invitation email arrived to participate in the QED forum, I just finished weeping on the floor for an hour. I'd found myself on the floor several times during the COVID-19 stay-at-home order. My new therapist called it a grounding technique. I wasn't coping with the stay-at-home order well, and finding pleasure in the pandemic, while again witnessing violence against Black people, relearning our bodies through my partner's gender transition, and overcoming an inability to finish writing projects, quite frankly, felt like a hilarious cosmic joke. What I did know is that this was not the time that I would offer some white feminist autoethnography about my incapacity for pleasure during the pandemic. I even said as much to my therapist, a person with whom I unexpectedly vibed in our newfound relationship in the spring. He knows I'm a professor, so he asked if I had ever read anything about pleasure in social environment. I'm a rhetorician who studies sex. And so I laughed so hard it caught even him off guard. Of course I had. When I caught my breath, he plainly said, "Great, what are you reading right now?" Black and trans voices have long taught me about the power of pleasure and about capacious and intersectional possibilities beyond the here and now. They've taught me to think both beyond an orgasm and alongside an orgasm. They've taught me to think collectively. I'd literally been resting near Adrienne Marie Brown's book, Pleasure Activism, perched on my nightstand for months when I finally opened it up a few weeks into the pandemic. The collection reminded me first how Black women, both then and now, work to amplify pleasure and the politics of feeling good under the conditions of white supremacy over and over and over again. Joan Morgan educated me about the variegated ways Black women, quote, claim pleasure and a healthy erotic as fundamental rights. Those ways she describes are marked with stops and starts and stutters, and therefore complicate our understanding of Black female subjectivities in ways that, quote, invigorate, inform, and sharpen a contemporary Black feminist agenda. Second, I was also reminded of Juno Roche's work that recognizes the possibility of pleasure despite cis heteropatriarchy. They've taught me the importance of asking about pleasure and discussions of gender affirmation surgery, gender transition, and the overall capacities of our bodies. Like Roche, I remember that asking how folks are able to learn about something new during a confusing time like COVID-19 might shape what pleasure can be and become during the pandemic. Although the beginning of the US COVID-19 outbreak wasn't the first time I'd felt this liberatory power of pleasure politics, the question, "What are you reading?" asked by my therapist called me to think about what pleasure could be beyond individualized modes of feeling good. What could pleasure be in the pandemic? What could it become? Could it ground our relationships over WebEx and Zoom and House Party, our marches to the district court for Black justice? Could we feel pleasure in our bodies without the presence of others? These were all of the questions that quite literally fueled my anxiety, my classrooms, my thinking, my hampered orgasms, and my loss for words on the page during the pandemic. In her reflection on pleasure as liberation, Kara Page describes how pleasure-based liberatory processes take time, trust, and relationship building. She emphasizes the importance of consensually understanding how to be moved and inspired by each other without sometimes assuming that that energy has to be sexual. Quote, that maybe that's just an erotic exchange that's actually about sharing knowledge, memory, power, and that to her is understanding levels of intimacy and relationship to liberation. The possibilities of pleasure emerge not only in the process of sharing knowledge and power, but also in the erotics of exchange and consent. These intimate processes are slow. Sometimes they ooze and sting, sometimes they delight and surprise. And as Brown makes clear in pleasure activism, we are living on fertile ground to explore how our collective power can be formed through this, what she calls an orgasmic yes. As a white feminist, that especially means following Brown, prioritizing the pleasure of, quote, those most impacted by oppression. Finding an orgasmic yes during 2020 and COVID-19 may seem insurmountable. And yet the emergence and the re-emergence of safer sex rhetoric and harm reduction strategies exemplify this reprioritization. Sharing knowledge, memory, and power, like Page says, and cultivating those slow, intimate relationships with others and ourselves under pandemic conditions build the foundation for a pleasure politics. When the New York City Department of Health released its memo on safer sex and COVID-19, queer folks all over social media went a-Twitter. The internet had already been bursting at the seams with brilliant think pieces on activist rhetoric calling for harm reduction and retrospectives on HIV/AIDS in the context of COVID-19. A governmental department echoed exactly what queer activists were already saying. Yes, you can have sex, and here are some tips for how to enjoy safer sex and reduce the risk. My queer kin retweeted and shared excerpts of that memo. They shared the part about making it a little kinky, the mentions of Zoom masturbation, the risks of rimming, and alternatives to those heteronormative visions of sex. Even clinicians concluded that while all forms of in-person sexual contact carry risk for viral transmission, intimacy and sexual expression at their core are central to health, and that wearing a mask during sex could even be a sexy option. It wasn't, of course, the NYC Department of Health who invented these approaches to sex under viral conditions. J.D. Davids reminds us that sex workers and trans folks produced and practiced many of these harm reduction strategies during the 1980s HIV/AIDS crisis. But grounding safer sex rhetoric and harm reduction strategies in the US history of HIV and AIDS is also not enough. Reflecting on the era before COVID-19, Davids writes that there's always been folks that had to think extra carefully about pathogens. And so J.D. Davids there draws our attention to the knowledge produced by queer disability justice activists. Amplifying harm reduction strategies, especially during a pandemic, empowers us not only to rethink the cis heteronormativity of pleasure and intimacy, but also to share in what Page calls knowledge, memory, and power. So to conclude, while COVID-19 continues to impact Black and Brown people disproportionately, the pandemic also continues to expose the disparities in healthcare across racialized class and gendered lines. Black and brown queer people especially have long had to assess the risks of desire and pleasure before, during, and after HIV, AIDS, and before, during, and after COVID-19. Confronting these truths through the voices of folks who live these realities is just one way to, quote, become fluent in one another's histories. I now know that the question, what are you reading, is a constitutive strategy of therapeutic approaches to think collectively. Asking, what are you reading, lures me out of my own brain, my own white experiences, my own anxiety, my own bullshit. Turning away from oneself and toward the collective might seem like a funny way to think about pleasure and what it can become in a pandemic. But as the queer feminist voices above teach us, pleasure can become a process of liberation when it de-emphasizes those individual transactions for self-care and instead works towards collective transformation. Queer feminist pleasure politics and the safer sex rhetoric and harm reduction strategies born out of them remind us where to find collective pleasure, despite or because the structures of power not always written in our favor. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Michaela. And our third speaker today is Joe Hsu, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Rhetoric and Writing at the University of Texas at Austin. Their work focuses on the interrelations of narrative and power. Joe is guided by the transcripting queer of color scholars and activists who have enabled their survival, and they strive to further the forms of mutual care and collaborative world building, that they have learned from these mentors and kin. Joe is in the throes of a book manuscript on LGBTQ+ Asian American storytelling as communal conscious raising and political agitation. Their paper is titled Containment and Interdependence, Epidemic Logics in Asian American Racialization. Joe.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks to everyone for giving us part of your Friday afternoon. I forgot that I mentioned that book manuscript in that bio, but I guess that's appropriate since I sort of start with it. Thinking about it here, when COVID-19 first arrived in the United States, I was working toward the end of that book manuscript, and we are now 9 months later, and I'm still working on the end of the book manuscript, but it has pressed me to think deeper about the ways that history repeat, but also how we continue to deny certain parts of those histories and their effects on the present. So even as all of these think pieces and articles came out about how the anti-Asian rhetorics, the xenophobia that we see right now resonates with early incidents in US history, I was struck by how often we still talk about Asian American experiences, past and present, in isolation from other racialized, gendered histories of the United States. So a little bit of history and then more toward what I'm doing in terms of rhetoric in this article. Asians arrived in large numbers here following emancipation, when white settlers needed a new source of cheap, replenishable labor to continue forcing indigenous people off their land. And the best known example is probably the Transcontinental Railroad, which was built primarily by Chinese workers who were actively recruited so that they could depress the value of Black labor. So all of this is so intertwined. In other words, Chinese indentured workers were dropped into the US economy in direct competition with Black and low-wage white laborers. And the efforts of these workers literally laid the groundwork for the white elite to travel into and steal indigenous territory. And when the rail line was done, it released 10,000 Chinese workers back into a diminished labor market. And it was then that white officials found that it was easier to scapegoat Chinese people by equating them with disease and degeneracy rather than directly accusing them of job theft or, God forbid, actually addressing the causes of economic inequity. So even though San Francisco experienced its worst smallpox outbreak before this political exigence, and thus without attaching the disease to Chinese people, city officials pinned all subsequent outbreaks, 1876, 1881, and 1887 on Chinese residents. So historians have since observed that these cases were probably arriving with migrants from the eastern United States, but public health officials blamed the residents of Chinatown, who were characterized as perverse both in unsanitary living conditions and in what Nyan Shah calls queer domesticity. That is, the social affiliations and erotic ties that defy the norms of all respectable middle-class heterosexual marriage. So it is through proximity to queerness that all Chinese Americans were characterized as carriers of disease. And under the banner of public health, San Francisco officials quarantined Chinatown. They fumigated every home. They condemned and demolished a lot of residences and businesses, all while smallpox continued to rage through white households. And so in my essay, I'm thinking about the paradox of epidemic logic. that it needs to hold intention, containment, and interdependency. That is, so like for governing officials to justify containment, they need to constantly produce anxieties about the porosity of our borders and the threat of foreign invasions. Epidemic logic then creates this presumed dichotomy where the threat of the virus is always out there, belonging to other, capital O, bodies, and we protect ourselves by keeping the other out. And this association of Chinese bodies with destitution was more a directive than a description. It made Chinese communities more vulnerable to poverty and illness. And Chinese immigrants were sequestered into cramped neighborhoods with rampant police extortion. They were denied regular city services like waste removal, ensuring that Chinatown would actually resemble the squalid living conditions for which it had become known. And when epidemics appeared in the rest of the city, even though Chinatown had fewer smallpox cases per capita, the patients were barred from public hospitals for fear of contamination. And so rhetorical containment did not actually prevent the spread of disease, but it did effectively render Chinese populations disproportionately vulnerable to illness and death. And so the discursive attachment of the virus to their bodies also designated them as physical containers through which the city sought to protect its white residents. And in the case of the novel coronavirus, we can see this containment sort of differently diffused among racialized people, but it still serves a similar function, which is to insulate the white middle class family from the ravages of broken public institutions. And as other writers have pointed out, Asian Americans, and those who might be mistaken for East Asian have been scapegoated for this disease that has primarily targeted Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities. And I probably don't need to repeat for this audience all of the disproportionate rates of fatalities among Black communities, high cases among Latinx folks, the really horrifying repeat of US history in which the federal government denied resources to Native Americans at the mercy of a highly contagious disease. So none of this is new, but what is new is the way that a lot of prominent Asian Americans have responded. Presidential candidate Andrew Yang emphasized that Asian Americans are, quote, now being targeted in ways they've never experienced before. Congresswoman Grace Meng attributed sex exclusion to her parents' generation, adding, quote, for this to happen brings up these feelings that I always assumed were part of people's history. Most media coverage also likewise regarded the anti-Asian outlash as this revival of an otherwise ancient past. And this view speaks for a very select fragment of Asian American experience, one that has been engineered and rewarded by white supremacist institutions throughout this past century. And I can't help, when I wrote that passage, I couldn't help but think about the vast difference between those statements being made by like really prominent, famous Asian American celebrities and politicians, and the conversations I was having with like queer Asian American elders who were out in the 80s as part of HIV and AIDS activism, who were just saying like, we have been here before. And it feels exactly the same. And so the assimilationist drive that has created this prominent version of Asian American identity, the model minority stereotype, is what empowers Andrew Yang to campaign on his American dream immigrant story. It was built on the erasure of queerness and trans folks and LGBTQ Asian Americans and the integral roles they've played in racial and queer liberation movements throughout the history of the United States. Not long after the smallpox cases that I talked about, social workers in Chinatown began training children to perform white gender norms to prove the assimilability of these younger generations. And a few decades after that, we get the New York Times and Time Magazine writing about Asian American WIDS kids and how they outperform problem minorities. So it's this hyper-individualist emphasis that we see again, this detachment from US racial histories in vocabularies like pre-existing conditions, as if those conditions weren't exacerbated by cyclic poverty, redlining, overt and covert discrimination in education, healthcare, employment, and all our social institutions. So returning to epidemic logic, I'm thinking about how most state institutions lean into containment, but containment, rhetorical or physical, has mostly exacerbated existing inequalities and denied our interdependencies. And more, containment plays into this divide and conquer sort of tactic that white settlers also intentionally designed when they imported Asian bodies onto stolen land. And instead, I'm wondering, and I hear this in the papers of my co-panelists, which I really appreciate, I wonder what it would look like to build a broader collective response with the logic of interdependence, with that flip side of epidemic logic. What futures emerge when we acknowledge the inextricability of our lives from the movement of bodies, human and animal, enabled or forced by globalization? What possibilities emerge when we accept that we are all affected by the environmental damages of industrialization, which has driven up the rate of zoonotic outbreaks? And what would the world look like if we took responsibility for the ways that we have, intentionally or not, participated in the harms that colonization perpetuates on other peoples who do not necessarily look or live like us? So to put it differently, what if we looked for and cultivated intimacies among our communities and our histories, intimacies that white heteropatriarchal dominance has tried to render unimaginable?
Great, thank you so much, Joe. And finally, Jessica Kerr is a postdoctoral associate in communication studies at Northeastern University. Her research focuses on the rhetorical interaction between individuals and institutions over political and social issues, primarily trans, queer, and economic issues. She is the second editor of Speech and Debate as Civic Education and co-wrote the most recent edition of The Rhetoric of Western Thought, a book I may have used a couple decades ago as an undergraduate. Her work has received numerous awards, including from the History of Economic Society and the Penn State Commission on LGBTQ Equality. Her paper today is titled The Homonormative Economic Frame in COVID-19 Relief Debates. Jessica.
Hi, thanks for that wonderful introduction. It was great hearing everyone else's papers first. So I wanted, when I got Jeff's email about early April, I was myself affecting a lot of similar issues that I guess got reflected in the paper because I'm a postdoc. I had no idea whether I would have a job right now. I thankfully do have a job right now, but of course now I have no idea whether I'll have a job next year because postdoc. So I think that speaks to one of the ways in which COVID-19, coronavirus, et cetera, has affected multiple facets of life, not only economic ones, but also trans and queer life from where one works to where one finds community. And a lot of those things are usually outside of the purview of mainstream discourses. And we can see a lot of this in that dichotomy of those responses between, say, community organizers and then state and federal lawmakers. And that, I think, provides insights to how the various ways and different ways that, say, trans and queer life and economic life can kind of interact. So in this paper, I argue that what ends up happening is that homonormativity affects the way that we have political debates over economic issues. So if we look at the response by lawmakers to the pandemic, if you can remember back to March, know that's slightly difficult because a lot of states weren't even shut down for the first time, let alone the second time. What I look at is how they employed what I'm calling this homonormative economic frame. For lack of a better term, it's, you blend what homonormativity is with how we understand an economic emphasis on issues. And what that is we see this replication of, let's say, the standard definition of homonormativity as relying on this quote unquote privatized, depoliticized gay culture anchored in domesticity and consumption that more or less emphasizes good sexual citizens who adhere to those normative structures. So in economic terms means that these norms are reflected by where and how one works and by where and how one spends their time. Homonormative economic frames attempt to assimilate then trans and queer individuals under the umbrella of mainstream economic problems, being able to afford a mortgage, raising a family, securing one's 401k, yada, yada, yada. And what usually ends up happening is quite simple. They just swap out the representation of the advertisement, et cetera, depicting the problem. So since 2008, TD Bank was one of the first banks to feature same-sex couples in advertisements for a variety of financial products. There's not really any difference in the advertisements except the expressed gender of the people involved in the advertisements. So what that frame does, though, is it privileges certain types of work and economic practices over others. And in the context of the pandemic, that gets tied to how relief efforts are then debated and directed. By contrast, the response that we see a lot by community members, and I'm sure we all saw in our own local communities, is sometimes those community members might center various facets of queer life, but oftentimes they might get ignored depending on what community priorities are, what community centers and activists are already set up, so on and so forth. So a lot of the things that might get ignored range from things like gay bars, trans and queer student centers on college campuses, local theaters and community spaces, or other random outlets. One such one is at that I thought of at the time is by BLOW, which is BLOWW. It stands for the Boston League of Wicked Wrestlers, which is this queer and trans inclusive amateur wrestling league. You might think of like Glow on Netflix. It's pretty much the same thing, over the top personas, and a whole bunch of fun, a whole bunch of good queer fun. So back in March, Congress passed the CARES Act, their first and only form of stimulus for the pandemic. And if you remember how they detailed various problems, it was about evictions, it was about small business relief, and other issues affecting like state and local lawmakers. So like school funding for devices, meals, so on and so forth. So economic coverage then of COVID-19 really focused on those things: unemployment benefits, housing security, and other ways to continue healthcare access to provide new materials for individuals. Mainstream queer and trans nonprofits such as the HRC, the Human Rights Campaign, and the Williams Institute at UCLA more or less took the bullet points from the CARES Act and then just said how many like say people, trans and queer people, were affected by it. So instead of here's what unemployment is in the US, it was here's what unemployment is for trans and queer people in the US. And you could just like go through the bullet points of what like the Democrats and the Republicans had as their bullet points, and it's just like reiterated with the slight ratio adjustment. Excluded from this discussion, though, were what you can call non-heteronormative acts of labor, such as sex work and trans and queer spaces, such as gay bars. Since relief via the CARES Act, not the Queers Act, which sounds fabulous, was funneled through the Small Business Administration, the SBA, which is a federal agency. Sex workers are automatically barred due to any funding or assistance through the SBA. It's a federal regulation due to their quote unquote prurient sexual nature of their work. Implicitly, other trans and queer spaces might not be necessarily excluded from the CARES Act. I'm going to keep saying that throughout the entire presentation, but they also had disproportionate impacts affecting them. So a lot of the relief from the CARES Act went to those same organizations who can discriminate based off of religious preferences, etc. So homeless shelters who are now allowed to say no to queer and trans people for their religious beliefs, or get money from the CARES Act, which means that, we're not necessarily excluding trans and queer people from home security relief from the CARES Act, but they can't get it from the housing agency because they're able to discriminate on the government's behalf. So what happens then is we have this homonormative economic frame surrounding COVID-19 relief that explicitly and implicitly excludes assistance for people, to people who lack, what might be considered good sexual citizens. By contrast, we have trans and queer community members who turn to their own support networks, mutual aid networks, so on and so forth. Sometimes these are national with celebrities. Sometimes these are more local. And what we saw a lot of these is they emphasized issues that would be particularly affecting queer and trans folks during the pandemic. So local centers would often send direct payments, distribute donated goods, and they focus on like particular things such as for trans individuals like financial access to transition-related care, which if you know anything about trans-related care, it's considered usually cosmetic or not emergency related, things of that nature, not medically necessary. That's the term of art. They also focused on other things such as the Trans Clipper Project in Boston circulated hair clippers so trans folks could cut their hair and have some type of gender affirmation in their lives. So while a lot of these issues may affect everyone, some straight bars and other centers may have also closed, employees in general have been laid off, and some cis people's hair grew to unflattering styles. The closing of a straight bar does not foreclose the one spot where a straight person could find community. The furloughed retail worker is able to file for and receive unemployment, unlike the sex worker. Folding these experiences together then with the trans and queer student forced back into the closet of their parents' home, or the sex worker being evicted because they can't get unemployment, means that how we debate economic issues, whose voices, whose labor we emphasize, and whose we implicitly or explicitly exclude, has this capacity through this homonormative economic frame to dictate and function as another barrier to queer liberation during, before, and after COVID-19. So that's more or less what the paper focused on and what I've been interested in, because a lot of, I think, of how we experience queer life is through various economic spaces. And I really didn't think about that until I no longer had access to those spaces.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for those fabulous papers. I'm so excited to see them in print. We had a question come in from J. Blake Scott, who is also a contributor to the QED forum. So thank you for that, Blake. And I'm assuming all the panelists can see the question. I don't know if you had the chance to review it, but I was wondering if anybody wanted to answer it. For those who can't see the question, it just asks about the expansion or readaptation of queer harm reduction practices during the ongoing pandemic. And Blake asks, in what ways have or can these also enact racist, sexist, and other harmful power dynamics, and how might we need to adapt our critique of such dynamics? And he notes in particular that he was thinking of mask porn. Did anybody want to?
Yeah, I can jump in about that real quick. So I think this is exactly what some of these Black feminist pleasure politics scholars and activists are talking about. Maybe not mask porn in particular, but I think, so when Kara Page talks about sharing in knowledge, memory, and power, she's also following the writing of Audre Lorde. And Audre Lorde's commitment to sharing joy, to sort of connect those, to form a bridge to connect difference, was always predicated on the logic of consent. She famously said, well, what's the quote? I'm gonna mess it up. I think it's like, the use of the used without consent is abuse, something like that. And I think that that's exactly what representational forms of pleasure and sex like pornography lend themselves to, especially when we talk about like the material conditions of production of pornography, right? So like not queer productions of pornography, not feminist productions of pornography. And so, yeah, I think that that risk of reinscription or like the redoubling down of some of those harms, the sexist harms, the racist harms that get attached to those harm reduction strategies are totally contra to what some of these scholar activists have been advocating for years. But I think it's a great question.
I'm thinking about a lot of things in relation to that question, so I don't have a coherent answer, but I'm just, certain instances and images are coming to my mind. I'm thinking of the practices that a lot of queer people have, particularly I think trans women and queer men, of like, I think it was you, Michaela, who was referencing like the ways in which post-HIV we've had to adapt our sexual practices in order to keep ourselves safe, and how COVID just adds sort of another layer to that, right? So it's now not just like, have you been tested for all your STIs, but it's also like, have you been tested for COVID as well? And the difficulty of our insurance system, the difficulty of the tests themselves, right? Like make those harm reduction practices very, very difficult. But I think I'm also thinking of the flip side of like the positive forms of queer harm reduction I've seen, at least in Chicago. I was really kind of heartened and warmed of how this pandemic actually supported this organization here called Brave Space Alliance, which some people know because Lily Wachowski isn't on the board. But when the pandemic hit, this was a Black trans-led organization that provides food, clothing, and other kind of material needs to trans people in Chicago, because some of the main LGBT organizations and other service organizations are not competent in dealing with trans people. They received a flood of money and donations and continue to. Even when I go to my bougie coffee shop, the donations are not for the people making your coffee, but rather to Brave Space Alliance, right? They kind of became like the symbol of like supporting queer and trans people in Chicago for this year, because of course the need was so great for local trans people. and they happen to have been well positioned by being connected to more kind of famous trans people, if you will. And that's harm reduction, right? Like that is for me, you know, harm reduction for trans people, having food and clothing and like some basic supplies, right? So I think it's cutting a lot of different ways. I think we're definitely seeing the breakdown of systems, and systems that were already harmful are of course becoming more evidently so and more harmful. But I think in small ways, we always do resist those dynamics as well. And queer people have a sense of how to support each other in ways that are, yeah, they're smaller, but they're there.
Thanks. It looks like we have another question that I get the impression by looking at people's eyes on the screen they are processing right now. But Pamela had a question about the ways in which analogies to HIV have been brought up. I'll let you read that, but if I could just summarize the last sentence, it just says, I wonder if anyone has thoughts about the interplay between HIV/AIDS and COVID and how that history is being leveraged in mainstream media. Thank you for that, Pamela. Did anybody want to?
So I think that definitely, so aside from like, I think what that analogy appropriation is doing a great example of is like showcasing that if a problem affects, you know, like these normalized bodies, it's easier to like repurpose analogies or historical examples, et cetera, affecting like, let's say the less normative bodies, right? Because that's exactly what's happening here. It's like, as you know, most of us have either read or know about, et cetera, like, it's just like not true at all that it's at all the same from a medical perspective. Like there's research being done within the first year of like COVID-19. They're not like waiting years to do like vaccine research or treatment research. They're treating COVID-19 patients. Yeah, they're treating COVID-19 patients. And I think what that does is it speaks to like when we can paint problems affecting queer and trans folks with like this normalized body, it means that it's easier to marshal support and relief for those types of problems than if a problem's going to have a, let's say, like an explicitly queer angle for it, because as we know, like HIV/AIDS had like this explicitly attached to angle of like queer sex to it, which made it harder to digest the efforts for relief. Similar, like when we look at relief efforts in 2020, the ones that are able to have, it's like, oh, it's people's homes, it's people's 9-to-5 jobs, it's easy to get relief. Someone's job is sex work, not easy to get relief. So I think you're seeing a similar analogy here, analogical appropriation use, that if you can normalize something, it's easy to use it. And if not, people don't want to use it.
Yeah, building off of that, I was thinking a lot about that too, in the sort of like superficial equation, and by queer folks too. You know, the meme that circulated that was, oh, you're surprised that the government might be willing to let a condition run rampant through your community, and it's, but the problem is one that it's not the same, and the more complex conversations in there are the ways that we assign blame and individual responsibility when it comes to disease and contagion, and that there are communities right now that are being told that it is a pre-existing condition, or that it is you know, that you were already inherently susceptible for things that were out of the government's hands, and that is not, that I don't see that conversation happening so much as, you know, the flat comparison that does not allow for any of that complexity.
Yeah, especially not in the mainstream. I mean, I don't know if I have a formed answer to the mainstream media component of that question, but certainly in queer spaces, whether that's like in a publication outlet like them or just amongst queer kin, there are these conversations amongst queer elders that have been shared with those of us that are younger about how very hurtful that sort of individual blame rhetoric is to hear at this moment, where it's like, are you kidding me? I can't believe we're making, you know, that parallel, that connection in that time. And so as a younger queer, I really appreciate when our queer elders share that knowledge with us.
I also think there's something about, there's a couple things going on for me in terms of when the initial shutdown started happening in the East Coast and the Midwest shortly after, there was a sense of like, well, this is a great kind of equalizer. Like we're all in this same position. And then it was slowly revealed over time how actually this pandemic affects people so differently based on so many factors of their own identity. And I'm thinking about the ways in which even our historical understanding of the HIV pandemic is similarly kind of flattened often, especially in mainstream representations of it. I mean, most of the mainstream representations that I've seen of the HIV pandemic is very white, very male, and very middle class. And that wasn't the way it was then, and it certainly isn't the way it is now. So I think there's lessons in terms of how we imagine pandemics that we still haven't yet learned.
Great, thank you. We also had a question come in from Jonathan that I hope everybody has had the chance to look at. And Jonathan expresses concern, especially about ageism in relation to LGBT communities, Q communities, and simply asks, what does a queer response look like to such ageism, to the sense that certain bodies are expendable? And he says he asked this also in recognition of how homonormative and homo-consumerist cultures are often more youth-focused and oriented than not. And before I turn this over, I did want to just reiterate one of the pieces we have in the QED forum is from Sage Metro Detroit, and they do really great work with aging LGBTQ plus communities, and especially LGBTQ communities of color. So I hope that people check out that piece. It's really well done, and they do really important work, especially in a city like Detroit that was hit very, very hard by the pandemic. But thoughts from our panelists about this inquiry?
So I really want to jump on that because I've been thinking a lot about the temporal politics that accompany COVID-19 and pandemics. And I think a lot about among trans and queer of color communities, the reverence that we have for elders and for our ancestors, which is, I mean, obviously our deep interpersonal ties, but also like survival mechanisms, like when your own histories and your communal knowledge is actively erased and suppressed so often, these people are the reasons you know how to live. But you don't, like Jonathan's saying in that comment, you don't see that necessarily in homonormative cultures. And you see that reflected in prominent conversations in the United States, especially where there is just no regard for past or future. Like we live now, but there is absolutely, like, we don't care what world we are leaving for other people when we're done, playing with our present time. And we certainly don't seem to have any regard for our elders in terms of, like it's just affecting the old people. So yeah, I don't know that answers the question, but that really struck on something that I've been thinking about in terms of discourses surrounding the pandemic.
I'd be really interested in reading that piece. I sit on an advisory board here in Chicago called Pride Action Tank, and they look at sort of the parts of the LGBT community that we historically have not focused on, especially given all the money that went towards marriage in the early 2000s. And seniors is definitely one of them. And I've learned a lot about aging queerly. And it's quite sad, actually. The vast majority of nursing homes are not literate in how to deal with LGBTQ people. A lot of people go back into the closet when they go back into nursing homes. A lot of elders are lonely. There's not a lot of intergenerational spaces. And I think, Jessica, your point about how so many of our spaces are consumerist is a huge part of that. And so I think as much as the wise queers of us do respect and honor our elders, I think systemically it's very difficult to maintain those bonds. And just thinking about the fact that COVID has affected nursing homes so intensely really makes me think about how difficult it must be to be aging right now. And I don't know ultimately how much better we are at it. And I don't know if it's our fault. I think it's a systemic issue of there not being any investment or market demand for queer elder housing, right? And the challenges of maybe the kids of queer people, not really supporting them in that way. So it's a vexing issue, and I think a queer lens makes it even more so.
I think a related thing to this, it's with how the expendability of bodies, especially elders, that comes into play is a recurring critique of like anti-discrimination laws. Not that, and what this is that one of the things that has happened with COVID is that, so, you know, various states have anti-discrimination laws in terms of like employment, medical practice, et cetera, even if there's like not really federal ones. But that what has happened during the pandemic is now you can like neglect care and use like, and have like excuses for homophobia and transphobia. It's like you're not neglecting this person in the retirement home or the nursing facility or the hospital because they're queer or trans, it's because you're stretched thin for COVID related reasons. Or you're evicting this person not because they're trans or queer, you're evicting them for you know, pandemic related reasons. So I think like one of the things this definitely affects is that when we talk about folks who are being neglected, is that what we think of like as protections for trans and queer folks can easily be cast aside when we can point to other excuses like, you know, what the pandemic's been doing to hospital budgets, so on and so forth, which I think speaks to the issue that if we only have anti-discrimination laws tied or recognizable due to consumerism and spending money and things of that nature, it means, you know, these ways that we've mainstreamed queer and trans protections are kind of like meaningless, and allow things like ageism to get exacerbated and allow for other forms of bias to get exacerbated that affect trans and queer bodies.
Absolutely. One of the things they also mentioned in that piece, just to follow up on some of this, they focus a lot on queer kinship networks and, you know, what happens when the kinship you are dependent on for food, or if you are somebody who does not drive, or just company is suddenly taken away from you. And it's a great piece, and it's heart-wrenching, and I think it's very instructive for a lot of us. We have about 3 minutes left. Were there any questions from our audience members that we can entertain? If not, I think we can go ahead and wrap up. I again wanted to say thank you to RSA and Syracuse and to Chuck and Tom, and especially to our panelists today for taking the time to be with us and share these wonderful papers. I'm really, really excited to see everything in print. So thank you all very much. I hope you have a nice weekend.